Hello there, people of the internet. How is everybody doing today? I'm doing alright, thanks for asking. I'm probably going to need this right here for this video. This is an 1872 open top. We'll go ahead and we'll talk about this here in a second. Actually, before we get started, if you like things like this, I show off things like this all the time on this channel, so subscribe to the channel because you are among the right crowd. All that being said, this is something I've ran on the YouTube channel and I have brought it to the gun range numerous times. If you want to help me get back out to a gun range because mine is currently unavailable, then well, there's a bunch of ways you can do that. And down in the description you're going to find a link to Patreon and Utreon, or I'm selling some t-shirts to help the cause, so go get yourself a t-shirt, also found down below, or you can do a one-time donation through the t-shirt page. So back in 1873, Winchester ended up putting out their 1873 lever action chambered in 4440. It was a revolutionary cartridge, had a 44 caliber projectile that had 40 grains of gunpowder behind it. I think it traveled at about 1,400 or so feet per second, if memory serves me correctly. And I want to say it was either a 200 or a 215 grain bullet, somewhere around that ballpark. Not exactly a powerhouse of a cartridge, but definitely powerful enough and capable enough to handle most of the things that most people were going to be encountering back in the day if we are talking about defensive and offensive purposes, specifically against two-legged critters, two-legged targets. We're not going to be talking about using these for any sort of wild animal game gathering or defense. We're talking specifically against two-legged variations of beings. So back in 1873, the lever action in 4440 was what a lot of different gunfighters decided to use because it was powerful enough to take care of most of the things that they needed taken care of, and it could reach out to the distances that most encounters were taking part in. During this particular time period, combat was not taking place at very far distances simply because of the issues with black powder and it not being able to really propel projectiles all that effectively. So as a result, most encounters during this particular time period were between 1 and 300 yards, which is about what we see in modern day. And a lot of that has to do not only with the capabilities of the cartridges, but the capabilities of people as well. By a huge margin, we still see, even in modern combat, most encounters and most situations take place within that 300-yard mark, which the 4440 is absolutely adequate in. But I digress. That's probably a topic for another video. As a matter of fact, I'll make a mental note to make that into another video. Gunfighters back during this time period with the adoption of the 4440 would get a lever action in that 4440 cartridge, but they would also turn around and get themselves some sort of handgun or revolver, probably the 1873, because the 1872 originally was chambered in 44 Henry rimfire, if memory serves me correctly. They would get some sort of revolver also chambered in 4440. This way they could have their primary and secondary firearms both chambered in the same kind of cartridge. And this dramatically this dramatically aids in logistical issues. You don't have to worry about logistical issues having to supply yourself with multiple cartridges for your multiple firearms. Back during this time period, if you had your lever action in 4440 and you had some sort of revolver also in 4440, go out and get yourself one single box of 4440 Winchester. And you can use that to supply both of your firearms, and just logistically speaking, that is the most practical way to be able to do things. Now, times change, and cartridge technology has advanced significantly. By the standards and logic of what that was before, we have adopted significantly different principles by today's standards, and a lot of that has to do with our capabilities of being able to touch out to longer distances. That being said, most people aren't really going to be touching out to said longer distances. Basically, your average shooter maxes out at about 300, maybe 400 yards. Even if they are well adversed whenever it comes to different firearms usage and whatnot, they still tend to max out around that 300, 400 yard mark, and that's just something that you can train around to get better at, but most avid shooters aren't training around and getting better at shooting beyond that distance. So, what do we look at whenever it comes to today's equivalent of the 4440? There's a couple of ideals whenever it comes to that. The 4440 for the time period was very much an intermediate cartridge that was fired from a repeating firearm in that particular case. By today's standards, the standard intermediate cartridge here in the US is going to be 223 or 556. Well, 223, 556 is not something that you see readily in handguns. Normally you only see that in various rifle platforms. So yeah, already we're seeing a differentiation. Is that the word I'm looking for? A differentiation between what technology used to allow and what technology currently allows, based off of what the modern demand says is important. A lot of people will tell you that something like a 9mm is not ideal for a combat role, but in most civilian aspects and most civilian applications, if we're talking specifically against two-legged critters, a 9mm is absolutely adequate to be able to handle those jobs. And I'm sure a lot of people back in the day would talk about 4440 not being adequate enough to handle things, and yet it handled most of the jobs. That's probably one of the reasons why it was so predominant. But 4440 was weak enough and controllable enough and small enough to be a viable handgun cartridge, whereas something like 556 is not. Nowadays, something like 9mm, this is a Star Model BM, something like 9mm is absolutely, by a huge margin, the most common handgun cartridge here inside the United States, by a tremendous margin. However, whenever it comes to long guns, you don't really see, at least not by the same scope, you don't see 9mm carbines like this right here as an example. You don't see 9mm carbines all that regularly if we compare the numbers of 9mm carbines seen to the numbers of, say, 556 rifles owned here in the US. Nowadays, with just how good logistics have gotten and how simple things are and how good manufacturing has gotten and just the benefits that we have in the modern time, we can afford to utilize two different cartridges inside of our weapons platforms and not really have all that significant of a logistical issue. Now, that being said, that's not always the case. As a matter of fact, right now, I'm dealing with some financial issues. My resources for recording is very, very limited. And as a result, something like 556 is just out of my budget. I'm definitely better off getting myself like a box of 9mm to run in multiple platforms like what I have here. So there are some cost applications that people do have to worry about and think about, but logistically speaking, nowadays, something like 223, 556, and something like 9mm are both incredibly easy to get, and that increased logistical capability is one of the main reasons why nowadays the gunfighter setup is no longer two guns with the same cartridge. It's two guns that serve two different roles and two different applications that have two different cartridges. Like, for example, you have your handgun in 9mm to do handgun things, and then you would probably have your AR in 556 to do AR things. Most of your average shooters here in the US that own these ARs are not going to be able to shoot them beyond like 300 or 400 yards. Now, out at that range, shooting with 9mm is starting to get pretty gosh darn sketchy, but most people can't even manage to shoot beyond like 200 yards. Ask me how I know. I mean, that's kind of what I do. Most people can't manage to shoot accurately beyond that 200 yard mark, and I have shown that 9mm is very capable out at 100, 200, and even further distances than that. So even though the 9mm is capable at the distances that most people would be capable at engaging at, logistically speaking, if you had a 9mm handgun and carbine, that should be able to serve your purposes, assuming that we're just talking about defensive purposes. So all you would have to do is get yourself that one box of 9mm to be able to feed both your firearms. But still, most civilian firearms owners decide to go with a 5.56 or a 2.23 rifle and a 9mm handgun, so they don't have that increased logistical application of only having to worry about one particular kind of ammo. They would rather have the two different kinds of ammunition because one serves one practice or one practical application much better than the others. As a result, we see most households here in the United States that have an AR or that have a rifle and a handgun. In most of your instances, it's going to be something like an AR platform in 223, 5.56 and something chambered in 9mm. That's just become the de facto gunfighter setup here inside the United States. If you have somebody who's setting up to be a gunfighter, they have an AR and a 9mm. That is 9 times out of 10 what most people are going to have. I'm sure a lot of people are going to tell me, well, 38 Special is still out there, 45 ACP, that's still out there, or maybe somebody uses 380, or, insert your choice of caliber here. Yeah, there are definitely other calibers out there, but by a huge margin, by an overwhelmingly large margin, 223, 5.56, and 9mm are by a wide stretch way more common than other cartridges out there, like 308 Winchester. I do see 308 Winchester out there, and I do see mostly 223, 5.56, occasionally 308 and 45 ACP. Very rarely 7.62 by 39. I'm not talking about buying. I'm talking about like times where I go to public gun ranges and what I see people using, and whenever people approach me and ask me things, since I have a YouTube channel with like 14 million views on it or something like that, some ridiculous number that I never thought that I would get to. People ask me these things, and like way more often than not, they end up having a 9mm or a 223, 5.56, and that is absolutely crazy. The gunfighter's aspect, the gunfighter's loadout has changed dramatically based off of the technology that has become available to us and based off the logistical allowance that modern manufacturing and modern times give us. If we found ourselves at a point in time where things regressed and we found ourselves in a situation where people had to actually worry about their consumption whenever it came to their ammunition and they couldn't just go down to the local gun store and buy more, I think that we would see more 9mm carbines come out as opposed to 5.56, because 9mm is significantly easier to reload, and it is significantly cheaper, and it is still absolutely powerful enough to handle things that need to be handled. Who knows what the future is going to hold, and who knows what's going to happen with 5.56? Who knows? I'm sure a lot of people who were using 4440 back in the day were saying 4440 will never die. There's too many guns chambered in it, because literally everything was chambered in 4440. That was the go-to cartridge for the longest time. Well, guess what? Now it can barely be found. So I'm sure that we'll see the same exact thing happen with 5.56 one day. Hopefully not anytime soon. I like my 5.56 rifles. Thanks for watching, folks. I appreciate your time. I've talked enough about this. Like, subscribe, share. Description below has a link to all sorts of stuff. Go check it out. You guys go off, have yourself a fantastic day. I will see you guys on the next episode. Since I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. Poor man's Garen. Shame that bolt action shotguns aren't more mainstream.